I'll be taking you through the first part of the presentation on exploring the merits and demerits of carbon taxation. So for our outline today, we'll be looking at the introduction, the background, the merits of carbon taxation, demerits of carbon taxation, and Kenya's draft on green fiscal incentives policy framework. So for the first part on introduction, we'll be looking at why pollution is a negative externality. In economics, you have positive and negative externalities. So why pollution is a negative externality, we look at it from the point of the social costs that are incurred during the production processes. During production processes, firms factor in the social costs through the cost that they incur in their private costs of production. And in as much as they incur this cost, no one looks at the negative externalities that occur to this, and these are the negative externalities such as pollution. Next, we'll look at pollution as a non-pecuniary externality which justifies government intervention. By describing pollution as a non-pecuniary externality, a non-pecuniary externality can be described without any reference to prices. For instance, say a factory that dumps trash maybe near a home or rather maybe a river. This is considered as a non-pecuniary externality, which is joined to pecuniary externality. The pecuniary externality in this case is decrease in value of the region, like say degradation of the environment. Non-pecuniary externalities, they give rise to inefficient outcomes because they're external with respect to the subject generating them, and therefore they're not taken into account in market prices. Then we'll move on to the consequences of CO2 pollution. We'll look at it in three ways. We have the environmental effect, then we have the economic effect. So under the environmental effect, we look at loss of forest. When CO2 is emitted into the environment and the increase of CO2 and general global climate change, it causes changes in seasonal climate patterns, and this leads to loss of extensive forests. And also another issue still under the environmental effects, we have the rise in sea levels from increase in CO2 concentration in the environment. Next, we look at the health effect. Under the health effects, increase in air pollution from CO2 will increase an occurrence of respiratory diseases, and the effect of this will lead to increase in large public expenditure on health. And finally, we have the economic effect, and the economic effects will focus largely on agricultural production and services. If agricultural production and services is affected by increase in CO2 in the environment, this will lead to reduction in farm yield, like there's less produce by farmers, and this will affect countries that majorly importers of agricultural products and services, and it might lead to reduction in social welfare due to price increase. We've already discussed pollution as a negative externality and pollution in terms of emission of CO2. So we look at 4 ways according to economics on how to correct for externalities. The first one is taxation, which is charges and taxes. For a long time, it has been used to correct many externalities in case of a market failure. Ideally, it's deemed the efficient level of pollution occurs where the marginal cost of pollution equals to the marginal benefit or marginal abatement cost of pollution. So in case of negative externalities, it's normally advocated for use of taxation, that is charges and taxes, to correct this market failure. And taxes applied in order to equate the external marginal cost imposed by an externality, that is the negative externality of pollution, and it's designed to correct the market failure and improve the social welfare in the end, as the end goal. Next is regulation, that is issuing of tradable emission permits. By using tradable emission permits, this is a market-oriented approach to reducing externalities. Tradable emission permits are applied using the price or quantity intervention, and they tend to take a lot of effort, and often pollution control regulations require a fixed aggregate emissions reductions, and it's difficult to enforce this with taxes. So the other option for correcting externalities is the tradable emission permits. And under the tradable emission permits, a government issues a permit that allows a firm to emit a certain amount of pollution, and that can be traded to other firms. Next, we look at the coercion bargaining. Under certain circumstances, also as the third way of correcting externalities, it may be possible to reach an efficient market outcome through private negotiation other than involving government intervention. And that's where the coercion bargaining comes in. The coercion bargaining is described as costless negotiation among market participants, which will lead to the efficient market outcome regardless of who holds the legal property rights. So it's either a firm and a household are negotiating on how to come up with an efficient outcome for both teams. And the outcomes can be monitored, and individuals can coordinate and negotiate this without costs involved. Next, we have the solution. And under solution, I indicated this as deposit refund systems that require a surcharge to be levied on potentially polluting substances, which are then refunded if pollution is avoided by those recycling those substances. So this is sort of a reward for those who reduce their carbon emission. Next, we look at facts and figures on CO2 emissions. And under this, we look at the EAC, a comparison again across EAC and the global emissions. So on the first column, we have the population, then we have the metric ton per capita, the total emissions in millions metric tons. Then we have the global emission as a share of the global. Then we have the GDP in $billion. Then we have the value added per metric ton of CO2 in dollars. Looking at this table, Kenya's metric ton per capita is 0.4. Uganda's metric ton per capita is 0.1. Tanzania's metric ton per capita is 0.2, and the global one is 4.4 metric ton per capita. Looking at this, Uganda and Tanzania's metric ton per capita, if you combine both, it's actually less than Kenya's metric ton per capita, showing that Kenya emits more CO2 metric ton per capita compared to both Uganda and Tanzania, and it's less than the global metric ton per capita. This is shown in the global emissions. The percentages of each country, that is Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, as a share of the global emissions per capita. So for Kenya, it's 0.06, Uganda it's 0.01, and Tanzania it's 0.04. Moving on, we have the value added in metric ton of CO2 in terms of US dollars. This was computed by calculating the GDP over the metric tons of CO2. So for Kenya produces at least 4,925.42 metric tons of CO2 in every production. Kenya uses 4,925.42 dollars, and for Uganda it's $8,201.86 for every metric ton. It uses 8,201.86. For Tanzania is 5,107.77 USD. So across all these, across the four, Uganda is Pareto efficient in terms of the use of its resources in production, since it produces this more value addition per metric ton of CO2 compared to Kenya and Tanzania. And the world is a bit lower compared to the EAC region. Moving on, in 2021, the IMF proposed an international carbon price floor with different price points for emissions for economies at different stages of development to incentivize greater participation and set different thresholds. High-income countries will be subject to a carbon price of $75 for every ton of CO2 emitted. For middle-income countries, it will be 50 per ton of CO2 emitted, and for low-income countries, that will be $25 per ton for the low-income countries. This would mean, if we go back to our chart, this will mean for a country like Kenya, this is data collected from 2019, it will mean Kenya might have to pay an approximate of $500,900,000 for the carbon price. That is data from 2019. Moving on, carbon taxation. Carbon taxation is a policy approach that aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by imposing a tax on carbon-based fuels such as coal, oil, and gas. There have been several meetings since there was a Kyoto meeting in Japan, then there was a Paris meeting to push for more of a green agenda. And one of the ways that has been pushed towards a more green-based agenda is through carbon taxation. And governments are using this as an approach to reduce the greenhouse gas emission. Carbon pricing creates signals and incentives for farms and households to reduce carbon-intensive energy use, and in the long run, shift to cleaner fuels, thereby cutting emissions and helping to meet official climate targets. So the carbon pricing, by imposing a carbon tax, it's an incentive and a signal for households and farms to reduce their carbon use. It's either by recycling or being innovative so that they pay less carbon tax. And as I said before, a carbon tax is a type of government intervention to address the market failure being pollution. And under carbon tax, the government set a price that emitters, or rather polluters, must pay for each ton of greenhouse gas emission they emit into the atmosphere. This is based on the polluter pays principle, where a certain amount of carbon will be paid for. Like, for instance, the high-income countries will be subject to a carbon price of $75 for every ton of CO2 emitted, and $50 a ton for middle-income countries, and $25 a ton for low-income countries. This is the chemical compound of CO2, and it's made up of molecules that each have one carbon atom, the one that is in gray. It is covalently double bonded on each side to two oxygen atoms. Yeah, thank you. I'll give the next session to comment.
Thanks, Maureen. So yes, as we've said, we come back from understanding that there are certain tools in the economics toolkit, for managing externalities. And as Maureen said, non-pecuniary externalities could be given, or others could be assessed in such a way that they have a pecuniary effect. Now, the use and carbon dioxide taxation is therefore one approach that could be used to achieve that effect. It comes with the idea that if you have a product that generates an externality for society, then one of the things that government could do, it suggests that there's a market failure in that market, and therefore justifies government intervention. So if we agreed on that, we have to ask ourselves then, what are the merits of CO2 taxation? In other words, how do you match carbon dioxide taxation to the goals that meet those social objectives or correct for the externalities that Maureen has spoken to us about? A student of economics knows that one of the strongest signals in an economy is a price signal. And the price signal is so important because every human being, whether at government, every entity, whether at government, farm level, or household or individual, is able to read price signals for the goods and services that they consume or produce, and based on that, know what judgment to make. The collective effect of those decisions is what gives us markets as we know them today. I also need to mention that the previous slide gave us a graphical representation of the carbon dioxide molecule. It's called a greenhouse gas effect. It's one of the most potent greenhouse gases. There are many others, but the carbon dioxide one is the most harmful by virtue of the fact that it's generated from different things that human beings do. It's an effluent which comes from, say, burning energy or burning petrol fuels. And when you do that, it is deposited into the environment. Now, that by itself is not a bad thing. I think what ecologists and those who study this, environmental scientists, have told us, and modelers have told us, is that the accumulation of this very stable. Remember, it has two covalent bonds, and covalent bonds in chemistry tend to be one of the most stable. Now, that stability between carbon and two oxygen atoms leads to this molecule, carbon dioxide, which is very, very stable, stays in the environment for very long, and its effective accumulation creates the ability of the sun, or rather the heat, to be trapped within the atmosphere without leaving. And so that creates a cumulative effect of warming. So it's the warming effect. So the consequence is what is harmful, not necessarily the carbon dioxide emission itself. So let's go to the merits. So one of the things that an economist thinks about here is to say, if carbon dioxide is the major greenhouse gas effect, in the sense that the greenhouse gas is the trapping of heat, and therefore that heat accumulated over time leads to more. Now, part of this change in the accumulation of carbon dioxide accumulation is not debatable because it has been measured. I think about 300 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution started, human beings started to use coal very intensely together with petrochemicals or one kind or the other, and the accumulation 100 years, every 100 years. So one of the things that happened was that ecologists, or rather those who study environmental science, measure carbon concentration in the atmosphere in terms of parts per million. So per million parts, it has moved from 300 to about 450, 420 or 430. So that's quite a bit, more than 50% change in the carbon dioxide accumulation in the atmosphere. It is then stated quite reasonably that accumulation is what is creating the greenhouse gas effect, which is creating the heat. So what governments are saying is that we need to respond to that accumulation of heat by reducing its accumulation and, where possible, to make sure that it dissipates over time. So carbon dioxide taxation means then you concentrate on the product that is causing the adverse effect and try to tax it. Why? Because, as I say, the price signal is that students of economics know that if you apply a price to something, it has two effects. One of the things that happens is if you change the price of products or carbon itself, one of the things that happens is you get less of it if the price signal is right. It gives the right price signal because people substitute for other products whose prices have not changed as much. And the second one, through substitution, basically. So people will substitute from dense towards others. But the second one is an income effect, which is basically because it creates incomes by making people who buy the more expensive product have less income, and therefore people who go for substitutes obviously have a higher income effect. So those two signals working together would achieve environmental goals at the least cost. The second effect would be, or the merit would be, carbon dioxide taxation promotes the adoption of cleaner technologies and energy sources, again calling for the substitution effect and the income effect. It provides incentives for anybody with energy sources or transportation alternatives that have less carbon dioxide density, right, to come in and compete with the products which generate more carbon. Because what externalities tells you is that carbon as it is today, whether it's through transportation, fueling vehicles, energy at home, heating, the products that have carbon and which generate carbon into the atmosphere do not pay the full cost of what effect they have on society. That's what creates the externality. Carbon dioxide taxation wishes to change that by providing a level playing field, which makes those who are able to provide alternatives. So it's an incentive to industry to generate on some alternatives that could compete with and substitute away from the more carbon dense product. The idea of a tax is not necessarily to reduce carbon dioxide diffusion to zero. It is to try to get it to a point where it does not generate as much adverse consequences as it seems to be generating now, or to try as much as possible to cap it in such a way that allows for the substitutes to rise. The third is a potential for raising government revenue, in the sense that because all societies, and you've seen in slide 6, which generates, we told us about carbon, the size of the economy, and showed us under slide 6 that Kenya, among East African countries, is the one that produces, is the one that uses more carbon per metric ton. Yes, this value addition per metric ton of carbon dioxide. So what this chart is telling us is this. If you look at it from the left coming towards the right, the way to read this chart is this. Carbon dioxide is an externality, generates an externality. What it's telling us is if you equate the value addition, which is the gross domestic product per year, and we adopted the year 2019 before COVID for obvious reasons, because it gives us the last year in which we've had more or less normal economic performance for all countries globally. What this chart tells us through those blue bars is Kenya uses 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide and generates $5,000 worth of value. Uganda generates $8,000 worth of value, about more than that. Tanzania, 5,000. So Kenya and Tanzania are close neck to neck. And the world creates $2,750 for generating 1 metric ton. Because carbon dioxide is harmful to the environment, what this chart tells you, the way to read this chart is based on these 4, Uganda is the most efficient economy in terms of value addition relative to carbon generation. It generates the least carbon for creating for creating the same amount of GDP value. because that's what we've corrected for here. Tanzania is at about 5,000 and Kenya is about 49 or thereabouts. So Tanzania is more efficient as well and all that. What you'd want, and this is where the carbon taxation comes in, is to reduce the density of carbon per dollar of economic value created, suggesting that the world is at almost half of where Kenya is. Tanzania is about at Kenya's case, and Uganda is almost 3 times ahead of where the world is. This is important for even political economy effects. It's not only telling us about the carbon efficiency of each economy, and this would be general for most African countries, which still have more efficient economies, whether it's because there's less use of transportation, energy-dense forms, but it's telling you that if cuts have to be made globally at the global level, because the carbon dioxide generation is something that has global effect, these are countries that still have more scope to adopt before they have to make cuts. Because on relative terms, these economies are low value, yes, in terms of income, but they generate $1 of income or units of income for much less carbon generation than the rest of the world. So I think that's the significance of this chart. So what are the demerits of carbon dioxide taxation? Obviously, when you have a tax, you raise costs. So what that means is goods such as energy, if you started to tax a product for carbon dioxide generation, it means, for instance, that global travel prices would change because those prices would affect, and it will also reduce the amount of travel that takes place. Both helps with the carbon effect. The second is products that have more carbon generation in them would actually be more costly than others. So it still has that price and substitution effect. The second demerit is carbon taxation may be regressive. It may be regressive because some of the goods for which carbon taxation may apply are consumed more by lower income people and lower income societies. In Kenya, for instance, kerosene, I give this as just one example lifted of the air, it's not necessarily the most, is mostly a good which economists call an inferior good, not for any other reason, but that lower income people use more kerosene per capita than higher income people. If you apply carbon taxation for that product, therefore, it will be regressive because most of the taxes will be collected, or the tax burden will fall disproportionately on those poorer people. The third effect, demerit, is it may impact the competitiveness of export-oriented industries in the global market. There's something called the pollution haven hypothesis. The pollution haven hypothesis is that if you read the chapter, one of the things that it would say that countries that still have scope for creating more carbon pollution is where some of the dirtiest industries should go, because they have not exhausted, quote unquote, their quota of carbon pollution. Now, if we have a globally, for instance, agreed carbon target and a tax, then one of the things that you could do is some low-income countries may actually lose the competitiveness that comes. And some of the most heavily polluting industries are mining, generation of petroleum, which some African countries, I think a third of African countries depend on export of minerals or petroleum products as significant revenue sources for government. So obviously, with that, it might have that effect. The third one is it is still difficult, not impossible, to measure carbon emissions, making it tough to set the right rates for carbon tax. Now that's a problem. It's a difficulty that can be overcome, but it's a problem about where to actually start and have the benchmark. Have the baselines. It's not impossible, but it's still difficult. And the fifth one, which is basically a political economy question, is the international political economy of carbon taxation requires that countries that export crude petroleum should bear a share of the tax, and this is difficult to achieve for fear of a reduction in national output. So it's related to principle 3. But as you know, for instance, within East Africa, I think a major exporter of crude petroleum is South Sudan, a country whose citizens have low social development indicators. So if you impose a very high taxation system on carbon taxes, when crude petroleum contributes close to 80% in some years, even higher, national government revenue, obviously there'll be pushbacks. So So here we're trying to talk about the social demerits, economic ones, and obviously there are also political economy effects. The government of Kenya published, I think about a month and a half ago, about 6 weeks ago, a draft green fiscal incentives policy. So what we're trying to talk about is all governments now accept. I think there are people who still debate whether humans are responsible for global warming or not, because global warming is given as a fact, whether it's a transient thing or whether it's going to the rest of human history. So we understand at the Institute of Economic Affairs that there are people who debate that. My view is that there's evidence that suggests that, yes, there's a human contribution to rising global temperatures is a very persuasive and strong case. So while we are conscious of the fact that there are people who still say that this is an unsettled question and the models that are being used are loose and weak, we at the Institute of Economic Affairs, at least I'll say for myself and my colleague Maureen, looking at the evidence that some of the models say that today it is not possible to rationally argue that this is not a policy question that governments should consider and that some externalities occurring because the effects of global warming in terms of seas, in terms of depletion, in terms of the creation of desertification, and in Kenya as well, we've had the 6th year of suboptimal rainfall, suggests that the green incentive program and considering what to do about carbon infusion is something that we ought to consider seriously. So when government published the draft green fiscal incentives policy, we tried to review it. Here are its policy goals. And I'm not talking about its policy goals, it's a 54-page document, which is very, very interesting because the question of carbon tax, which we are discussing today, appears on the very last page. But what I'd like us to say is trying to review its policy goals to see how this fits with carbon taxation or the idea of managing CO2 taxation. Now, so policy goal number 1 is direct government planning, budgeting, and procurement towards green production and consumption. So here government takes the persuasive case that this policy would help government to shift its purchasing behavior towards greater, goods that have less lower externalities and to reduce the externalities of government purchasing. So government accepts as an entity, it will be responding or trying to shift incentives to make government respond at the superstructural level. The second is to provide a framework for fiscal incentives to attract private sector investment into a low carbon emission, climate resilient, and environmentally sustainable economy. I think this is also consistent with fiscal incentives because, as we say, a taxation for carbon and using the fiscal instruments that we spoke about, our preference is a carbon taxation. I think this accommodates. So we are trying to audit the document for what extent it suggests that carbon taxes would be part of the portfolio or included in the policy quote-unquote framework the government adopts. And then the third policy goal is basically to provide a framework for generating additional revenue streams. So government is here interested in revenue streams looks like revenue streams as an end in itself. If you look at all 3 goals, the second and third are more directly related to carbon taxation or use of incentives to shift. And the third one is basically government's purchasing power and procurement capability. I think all those are still consistent with what we say, but the second and the third one are the most important ones. So we go to the next slide, having examined the fiscal incentives. The idea there are different forms of fiscal incentives that could be applied. And we know that Kenya's draft green fiscal incentives policy framework, as I mentioned on page 53, which is the very last page, has an accommodation for carbon tax. And it says that recognizing the ability of carbon taxes to both cost efficiently reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also to provide a revenue stream that can be used to meet broader government objectives, the government will explore the viability and design of a carbon tax in Kenya. Good statement, except that this is the last statement and it's only left at this level. Of course, because this is a draft policy incentives framework, I think that's a useful thing. It's suggesting to us at the Institute of Economic Affairs that government of Kenya, when the public participation is done, will be engaging with the public about how to design a good carbon tax system. And I think that places this conversation in a good place. We wanted to make reference because we know that the government has already accommodated through that article, section 4.2.2 in page 53 of the fiscal incentives draft statement. I think, in our view, the most persuasive argument that's been made for the use of carbon taxes came from a statement that was signed, I think, in 2019 by some economists. And obviously, you can tell here what carbon dividends organized by the Climate Leadership Council, and they examined what kind of tools and the mechanisms for using that. Now, we will not talk about the global politics of climate change, but we're trying to say here, what are some of the ways to go about it if we are persuaded, as we are at the Institute of Economic Affairs, or at least for I and my colleague, that climate change or global warming generated by excessive use of carbon products or products that actually generate carbon dioxide is part of the problem. So 28 Nobel laureate economists signed a statement, 4 former chairs of the Federal Reserve of the US government and 50 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors. So the idea of using economic tools basic economic tools to respond to climate change and especially carbon at state level, at the sovereign levels, is one that is very strongly supported by some of the most revered, but also economists with careful thinking, generated a lot of knowledge around this area, and actually use that knowledge to respond to this. You also notice that in the year 2019, the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded. Part of the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to an economist whose work was on the use of economics to inform climate change policy. Now, what did this statement say? So in slide 15, we see that among the things he said, well, this is too small, but among the things that they commit to is a carbon tax offers the most cost-effective lever to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed that is necessary. So here they are conceding to the fact that, look, it looks like it's been very difficult to get a global compact around how to resolve global climate change. The reality is there. Obviously, there's still people who are pushing back, but the point has never been that many countries disagree that something shouldn't be done. What many disagree upon is what tools may be used to achieve that policy effect at global level, because we all understand the collective nature of this. What we think, therefore, to be debated would be the questions about what policies should be adopted and what they achieve. And obviously, everybody's running out of time. And for that reason, they state this. So this will provide us a link to this so that we can read it. But all I'm trying to say here is that the idea of using carefully designed carbon taxes would be a useful one. In fact, they say that it would not be an additional tax. One of the things that could be done, it could actually be used for redistributive purposes. In other words, if we have a carbon tax in Kenya today, as designed, it can actually be used to offset other taxes so that it's not an additional tax, given that we Kenyans are convinced, and that's true, that we live in a high tax. We have a government that believes in high taxes and high expenditure. So this is just basically for the purposes of very carefully considered, just 5 clauses in general outside the preamble, and it creates the most potent case, in my view, that still stands. That statement has since been co-signed by many more people. I think it's more than 1,000, but it's a very carefully designed one. Now, how we sell it to global decision makers is a question, but the point for me is, as Kenya is considering green fiscal incentives, I think the place of carbon taxes should not be the back page, and even if it is the back page, it should be more elaborate. And the design of this structure is something that Kenyans should be contributing towards in the future. Finish with some case studies. Now, of course, carbon taxation could take place in many ways. One of those is basically to tax the carbon content of any product. Some other countries have an approach that has also happened before. One of those others is basically to take an arbitrary number and decide that if this is the arbitrary number of carbon that we'd like every year, carbon dioxide that we'd like emitted every year, on the basis of those emissions, you issue licenses and people can trade them as they wish. So creating a market around carbon trading, but having limited it. Over time, it provides the incentives, obviously, on the one side, and the price effect that enables companies that generate carbon to reduce it, those that cannot to actually trade them with others, creating that economic value around those carbon licenses will generate it. So that's the emissions part, as opposed to simply putting a carbon tax on every good based on the carbon that goes in it. The carbon tax is the simplest, as the economist stated, but it looks here that many countries are preference for carbon trade, which is to cap the amount and then trade licenses based on how much is capped. So example 1 is the EU has an emissions trading system, Green Deal of 2021. I think the tax equivalent is $64.45 per metric ton of CO2, which is very, very close to what the IMF had decided at 75. And one of the things is they have a border tax, which many countries, including African countries, have big opinions about, which is to say that if you bring in a product that has come from a country and it is produced using carbon, you'll pay the carbon equivalent in that. So part of it is both that, but also at the same time, within the EU itself, there's been an emissions trading system. So they're using both the emissions trading system and a direct carbon taxation for the goods and services. So that's it. So here is a mix. Example 2 is China. We started a national emissions trading scheme, I think in 2021 as well. It's one of the world's largest. And on the first day of trade, after those licenses had been issued, the trade in carbon taxes among corporations that wanted to trade with one another to get the ability to reduce more carbon was $32 million. That's large. It's the world's largest trading market for carbon dioxide. But here are also China's, we need to mention this, this is informed by China's 2 interests. The first one is to achieve carbon dioxide emission peak by the year 2030, and they're using this market instrument. We wish them good luck because I think they should. And the second one is to ensure that by the year 2060, 30 years after that first milestone, they achieve a carbon negative, a carbon neutral position in 2060. So very, very ambitious products using economics instruments. And obviously, in our view, those are good places. Now, we haven't found case studies of any African countries going this way. And we think Kenya's green fiscal incentives. Of course, governments have issued green bonds and all that. But our view is that using carbon taxes would be a very efficient way for the government of Kenya, for instance, to design a system that actually shifts incentives towards the use of more without necessarily arbitrary use of tools that either ban products, such as banning plastics, and all those other products. Tax incentives, well designed, can work. And a carbon tax is one that would be useful for some of the reasons that we mentioned. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks to both Maureen Baraza and Kwame Owino for...
I think the question you're asking is, would the extended producer responsibility relies to the fact that producers of goods, whatever they may be that have a polluting effect, should pay throughout the product cycle at the point of disposal. Now, one of the things that, and that's perfectly true, but what it does is it means that the producer bears the entire cost for the use of that cycle. Now, if we understand the basic economics that a market develops from both the demand and supply side, what a carbon tax does is to make sure that you distribute that burden between the two sides. Of course, it would not necessarily fall on them equally. It actually falls on which side has lower elasticity in terms of which side has less options for a substitute. So but the point of a carbon tax is actually to provide for both the consumer and the producers to do that. That's the first one. The reason an EPR is good, but a carbon tax well designed is marginally better, is because a carbon tax well designed also goes to dealing with services. There are services that people consume that have very, very significant CO2 emission effects. And if you have a carbon tax, it will actually have been embedded so that it shifts those incentives appropriately. So I hope that answers that. Hassan, you've asked a question. So let's go back. If Maureen, could you please take us back to chart 6? Because I think that's the most critical chart about the things that we've discussed today, and it's one that would help us to answer that question. Yes. So if we could make this, I wish we'd made it bigger. But Hassan, if you concentrate on this slide, because facts and figures and CO2 emissions. So what were we trying to do here? One of the things that we were trying to ask ourselves, what's the relative CO2 footprint of every country? And you take account of its population. So we just decided to concentrate on 3 East African countries, which is Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, and then the world. As you can see, East African countries, of course, the largest is Tanzania at 59 million people. And then we ask ourselves, what's the pollution for the year 2019, which is the most complete year that we could consider a year for comparison, for good comparison without the vagaries of COVID and its after effects. So the number of metric tons produced on a per capita basis tells you that Kenya has the highest in East Africa, but Kenya is still 11 times below the world average. Tanzania is 22 times because Kenya's is double, and Tanzania, Uganda's is basically almost 40 times. What this tells you relative to the world average is African countries are very low polluters on a per capita basis, right? And then we go to the total emissions, and what the total emissions tells us is just the story of what the total emissions are, which is basically what the population is multiplied by the per capita footprint. So what the per capita tells you is that if you divide all the carbon emissions that Kenya had in 2019 by the 50 million population, Kenyans, so you will be saying that every Kenyan generated 0.4 metric tons of carbon dioxide in the year 2019. So when you go to the total emissions, it's simply a multiplication of the population by the metric by the per capita and all that. So we ask ourselves, because we are thinking about it in terms of the economics. Kenya's share of global emissions is 0.06%, Uganda's is 0.1%, and obviously Tanzania. So African countries, or these East African countries' share of emission is very, very small. All of them together don't even add up to 1 percentage point. So now this is not about blame. But what we're trying to show here is that if you're going to solve this problem, African countries as they are today, and East African countries in particular, right, is not where the solution lies. So I'm coming now to your question. If we are going to push a global reduction in carbon, pushing African countries will be doing very, very small amount. They're not even responsible for 5% in total when we try to add it. So that's not where gains are going to be made. However, there might be gains in terms of thinking about how do we incentivize or allow for growth to take place without necessarily affecting or generating more global emissions. Now, what we wanted to find out was, okay, for the amount of emission that each African country is responsible for, what share of that, what is the size of their GDP? And by dividing that, the GDP size by the total emissions by country, what we are trying to generate is how much does each country produce per metric ton of pollution? Remember, this is pollution. So what tells you is that a country that produces more value per metric ton of pollution, which in this place is Uganda for the three that we have here, is actually a more carbon efficient country. For Uganda to match the global carbon value added per metric ton of carbon means it has almost 3.5 to 5 times as much to do. In other words, if you keep today's numbers, Uganda's economy could become 3 times as large as it was today, right? And still just match what the global, and raise its pollution and still just match what the global economy average is. So what this is supposed to tell us is, yes, you're right, that African countries are reluctant, and for good reason, to accept stringent stringent policies that would determine or shrink development. Or for African countries, the option is not development or the environment. African countries can say we will want both because we still have a very low carbon footprint on a per capita basis, both on a per capita basis, but also on a global emissions share basis. So you are right. I will read your question again. What are solutions to consider by developing countries that want to increase economic development programs? Yes. So African countries can still have economic development programs. We have had very aggressive arguments from other people in some parts of the world that we need to do 2 things. To stop growth, you've had a degrowth platform for solving environmental problems. And then there's another one that talks about degrowth, which is a reduction of growth. Others talk about populations and all that stuff. And the others that even talk about some crazy things such as all of us should become vegetarians. With respect to vegetarianism and all these other things, African countries are saying we don't have to make those aggressive choices today. But what this share is telling us is that based on global averages, African countries are not on a maximum, on a total emissions basis, on a per capita basis, or even on a GDP dependence basis, some of the most, the highest pollutants. So for them, for these countries, the idea that we are using very aggressive methods should not work. And therefore, actually, the cutbacks that African countries need to make are much less. In fact, a carbon tax would be useful in terms of just shifting the incentives to generate greener principles, but not because African countries are polluters and therefore need to be restrained through some global instrument or the other. I hope that is clear. Thank you.